They differ firstly in terms of levels of legislation that's focusing particularly on criminalising different forms of violence, but also in terms of how violence is understood. So Myanmar is still at the stages of developing legislation around women's rights, around gender equality. There are debates ongoing about what particular forms of violence should actually be covered by the legislation. So we see that difference. We also see in Pakistan the contradiction again that in terms of the legislation it's relatively strong. We've got work-based harassment laws in place, yet we know that out of each of the contexts, violence, particularly in terms of intimate partner violence, is particularly high. It's probably higher in Pakistan than in the other two contexts. So that, again, comparing but understanding the differences brings to us an understanding that we need to do or have more in place than just the legislation itself. Nepal is a very interesting context to follow because again we see legislation is being developed, but also a real commitment at the moment with the restructuring of the government and the decentralisation of government structures, a real commitment to pushing forward with programmes that take a gender inclusive lens, so making sure that women are visible at different stages of the governance structures. And violence is also a key part and acknowledged as a key part of achieving gender equality. So moving forward, it will be interesting to see how that maps out. So there's differences at that level, but that then has an impact in terms of understanding women's experiences of work, the different kinds of violence women might be more or less vulnerable to. In terms of this backlash, we can see in our data in Pakistan that women are particularly vulnerable to backlash. Gender norms, codes of conduct, the very strict delineation between what men should do and what women should do appears to be much tighter, and violence within that context then becomes a mechanism for essentially trying to reassert those lines and limit women's mobility outside of the home. We see that backlash to a much lesser degree in somewhere like Nepal, where women's participation in different forms, particularly within the informal structures, is to some degree accepted. In part that's related to levels of poverty, but it's also something about the cultural and social context itself that seems to accept women working as something that's part of sustaining family life. So we don't see that backlash to such a degree. In Myanmar, women are beginning to enter the workforce in much greater numbers, and in particular sectors such as the garment sector that's massively growing at the moment. And the garment sector is seen to be providing a very secure and ongoing income that families really appreciate. So because it's a new and growing industry, monitoring and looking at women's experiences of working in that sector moving forward will be critical. But because women entering the workforce has been much slower in that context, we're not necessarily picking up at this point examples of backlash, except interestingly amongst the middle classes and entrepreneurs, women who are particularly successful at running their own businesses in our research do report increased tensions at home, jealousy from their husbands who are not liking the fact that they're being particularly successful. So, as I said before, understanding these internal differences is also really critical, and how different groups of women may experience their working lives, but also then how that may or may not have an impact on what happens at home, and where and how violence interplays into all of that is really important.